All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name's Tom Graham from Dolby. With us today, we have our special guests from Lost in Space, Sam McCurdy, the DP, and Siggy Firstel, the colorist. We're excited to be joining you. Siggy and I are in the Los Angeles area, and Sam is in London. And we're happy to do this webinar, a Dolby Red participation here to help discuss the world of HDR. And if you are curious why our web cameras look so darn good, it's because we're using red 8K helium cameras, Siggy and I, and Sam has a Gemini in London. So thank you, Red, for the amazingly expensive and wonderful web cameras. We really dig it. So just a quick intro. Welcome again, and if you have questions, and believe me, we do want to hear your questions, you'll be able to type them into the questions panel. So go ahead and send a practice hello, tell us where you are. We'd love to see those questions start coming in, and we really want to make it an interactive journey here. So I can see already we've got hello from Phoenix, Atlanta, Sweden. Great, love to hear Mumbai, India, Calgary, London, Vegas, California, Brazil, Madrid. Okay, this is fantastic. So welcome everybody. Thanks. Great to hear from you. Keep the questions coming in. Occasionally we will publish the answer directly to you, but generally speaking, we'll try to take them on air, and we'll get to them as we go through. All right, so just a quick intro. Sam is a member of the British Society of Cinematographers, and has done both seasons of Lost in Space, several episodes of Carnival Row, Into the Badlands, and a Game of Thrones episode. Siggy, senior colorist at Company 3 in Santa Monica. He started in Australia, also worked in London and Southeast Asia. He's done some cool shows like SWAT, Narcos, Mexico, The Morning Show, and Spider-Man Far From Home. They've been working together now for a few shows. If you've seen Lost in Space on Netflix, it's obviously a hit show. It won several awards for Visual Effects Society Awards in 2019, and last year it won the Lumiere Award for Best Use of HDR in a Television Series. So super excited. And then just to set the context a little bit, we want to thank Netflix for letting us, work on the show, talk about the show, and share some information. Now, this data isn't the most per se current, but it is relevant to start the conversation. And that is, of the 600 million devices that members use to access Netflix in the course of a single month, over 165 million of those are configured for HDR. And they estimate 1 in 3 smart TVs used to access Netflix are HDR capable. And Netflix has well over 1,000 hours of Dolby Vision HDR content available in the catalog. And I think the number globally for Dolby Vision content is well over 2,500 episodes or movies now that are available. So I think I've talked enough. Let's say hello, Sam and Siggy. How are you guys doing?
Very well indeed. Thank you, Tom.
Awesome. So we'll dive in, and Sam, tell us about your camera rig that you use and the lenses that you have set up for the show.
This season, the second season of Lost in Space, let me start at the beginning. First season of Lost in Space. Ziggy and I's first real dive into HDR delivery for Netflix. And we kind of already chosen sensor and lenses for season 1. And for season 2, I personally wanted to try and up the level of what we could do with the HDR delivery. So I switched to the helium sensor on a Red camera, and we switched to Cooke S5Is for the lenses. I thought to give us just a little bit more of that cinema feel once Ziggy and I and everybody, Zach and showrunners and execs and everybody, once everybody had signed off on season one, I felt, as I'm sure so many people do once you've done a first, I felt we could improve. So we did. We changed the package up a little bit for season two. Obviously tested greatly with backwards and forwards with Ziggy, and yeah, plump for the helium and the Kook S5 eyes, to give us the look that I felt would best deliver the best looking HDR show.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a question, why helium versus Monstro? Again, it was to get that look that you had envisioned.
Sorry, I apologize. Yes, the helium was season one. We went to the Monstro for season two.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Yes. The
Monstro.
No, yeah. The Monstro suited our aspect ratio. To be honest, we got a bigger, without having to go to large format, we got a bigger coverage with the lenses we chose at a greater resolution on the Monstro than we would have done if we'd shot on the helium.
Cool. And then maybe why don't we talk about a bit, in the look and the style and the aesthetic of the show, how your roles are linked, so how you and Ziggy have worked together to develop that.
For me, it goes, Ziggy and I've been very, very fortunate, and Ziggy and I have done a few shows together now, which is great. So we have an understanding, a relationship that kind of is beyond just having to go, okay, here's the next DP, or going into, for Ziggy or for me, you're going into another color suite. So it was built hugely over season one. So when it came to season two, I knew we could do better. And between Ziggy and myself, I felt, look, let's build a lot. Let's find the real look for the show that retains everything in dailies, retains everything for visual effects and everything like that, but just ups the scale and the feel of the show for season two. And like I say, with the new lenses, with the testing, Ziggy and I tested over a good span of a good couple of weeks, backwards and forwards between Vancouver and Santa Monica, and had basically had Ziggy design and build us a LUT that would retain one single show LUT, nothing more, that would retain everything, as far as I was concerned, to give it a cinematic look, but also that would be thoroughly adaptable for the HDR grade that we would principally do at the end.
Yeah, it was important to sort of really improve upon what we had started in season one, with the calibration and the consistency of the look, and also sort of develop the look a little further. It was what Sam just said that we did. We sort of so we developed this look with the color science department here at Company 3 to sort of be able to give the visual effects, because Lost in Space is a really big visual effects show. Probably talking about 400 visual effects shots, and we're talking like full CG shots. So it was really important for them to be able to see the shots when they're building them, and to be able to move those shots into color and have them be exactly how they envisaged. Especially in HDR. So we not only developed the LUT for Sam for on set, we also came up with a LUT package that we supplied with the visual effects department, and that included an SDR LUT and an HDR LUT. So they were able to look at visual effects there at in both formats. So when they came into the color bay, there was no surprises. It was really important for them to see, especially how the highlights rolled off. You know, if we're looking at sort of shots that have like very sort of strong highlights, in episode 1, there's like this waterfall sequence, which there was a lot of spray and mist. So it was really important for them to judge the sort of highlight levels and how things rolled off in both the HDR format and the SDR format.
Right. And we do have one question that came in. What codec or what red codec did you use for recording?
I think Ziggy, I've shot a few things since then. I think Ziggy might have to go into his bank of discovery.
So what was the format? Sorry, the RD3 files, what were they? What was the question again?
Yeah, so you basically recorded camera raw. Is that essentially what you did?
Correct. Yeah, I think the files were like 6600 resolution. We debayered in red wide gamut 3G10.
Yes.
That's how we debayered the files. All the sort of visual effects were delivered. We delivered the files to visual effects through our portal device. We have basically a portal device where once all the footage is shot, we load that into our portal, and that allows the visual effects department to pull the scans automatically. And what the portal does is convert from the red raw files to their working format, which was EXR. So from a red log film format to a 16-bit linear EXR file. And the portal does all the conversion automatically. It also delivers the CDLs that were created on set. And at times there was a couple of scenes where they wanted to create a red planet, a warming planet, as part of the season. And the dailies were a little bit cooler in those scenes, in those locations. So we actually did a pre-color of a lot of those scenes, warming them up and kind of establishing the look on just all the plates and elements for the visual effects. And we supplied the portal with the CCC files for those particular scenes, which then were passed on automatically to the visual effects vendors as they were pulling the shots to work on. And that was another important part of the process, is to really get that calibration between on set here at Company 3 and in also visual effects for the visual effects vendors, is to be all of us to be able to view things accurately. But
Cool.
I think that's the working format there.
So let's just cover your Resolve rig at Company 3 and your setup. There's a couple questions around your color management, if you use ACES or not, what sort of monitor you mastered on, and then we'll jump back to prepping for season 2 in a minute. But let's just talk about Siggy's rig, if we could.
Yeah, we have Company 3 is we predominantly use Resolve, Blackmagic Resolve color correctors. We're running 4 GPUs in each of the box. We weren't using ACES. There was talk of coloring in ACES, but there was a decision made not to go ACES. We were using Sony X300s. As you can see there, we had the 2 monitors set up. Hero monitor in front was the HDR with the SDR one off to the side. And you can actually quite see the blues, how different they can be with the different color spaces between the Rec sort of 2020 color gamut versus the Rec 709 on the right. You can see subtle differences in the blue, and that's a good example of what we had to deal with. We were using Dolby version 2.9 I don't think the latest one was available when we started the show. So both season 1 and 2 were done on 2.9 Dolby.
So what color management did you use then in Resolve? There's a few questions around that.
Well, we use our own specific. We don't use the inboard Resolve color management. We have our own color science department, and we utilize essentially LUTs, an output LUT, and one of the ways I like to start and start a series is create like find a good LUT, and that can be in like Rec 709, and work with the filmmakers and Sam to kind of come up and establish a look and feel, and then I pass that LUT on, and I get basically two HDR LUTs back. One is that has peak white at 1,000 nits, and one that's sort of emulates, I guess, what 100 nits would be, like a Rec 709 that would be in HDR. So I then have the two LUTs, and then I essentially fade between the two to kind of get the level of highlights that everyone's feeling for the show. And that's kind of an important part of the process up front, especially in, on an HDR native show like Lost in Space. So yeah, so that's one of the things I like to sit down and discuss, because having the highlights too high or too low can really dramatically change the look of the show. And if they're too low, you're not really going to get the benefit as well of HDR. And a show like Lost in Space, I felt that I could probably push the highlights a little more, just with the style and look of the show. I usually sit the whites normally around like 200-300 nits. I think I went up to 500 nits on Lost in Space, just to give it the extra little punch when required. And that's not to say that the whole time I need to be pushing the whites or the highlights to 500 nits. I can clamp them down, and that's kind of the beauty of HDR, is that you can clamp them down and work within that range that you've established. But for Lost in Space, I think I kind of capped the highlights around about 500 nits.
Okay. All right, so let's sort of now move to your approach in testing for season 2. As you were changing camera lenses, you were sort of wanting to change the look of the show a bit. You did use HDR monitoring in the camera tests, correct?
We did, yes. We had, I think it actually ended up, at the time, I mean, this I know it's not long ago, but 3 years ago, I think, when we started testing for season 2, and being honest, it was difficult to get a hold of an HDR monitor in Vancouver at the time. And I think with some help from Company 3, we managed to get one. We knew still, even just then, we knew and it's a good show with a good budget. We knew we wouldn't be able to hold one for the run of the show, but we all felt it was imperative to have one for testing, to at least, for me, it gets me into a position where I'm happy then just monitoring and metering on set with standard monitors, but with my light meter, and having learned what we learned with testing backwards and forwards with Ziggy, knowing what I'd seen on the HDR monitors. And believe me, we went, it was a good couple of weeks of testing, of sending footage to Ziggy, having it piped back to us from Ziggy, then, having it run an entire pipeline through VFX, and ending up back with us or ending up back with Ziggy, just to make sure there weren't any, abnormalities, any strange changes, that said that everybody was seeing exactly the same footage as it went through. And it had to be done. I mean, it was, you know, even 3 years later, I'm sure it's much easier to get a good HDR monitor on set. I'm sure they've come down in price a lot as far as rentals are concerned. I know I have some friends that were shooting just recently in the UK that ran with a smaller Flanders HDR monitor on set for the run of show that seemed to serve them absolutely fine. So but it is imperative to know what you're looking at and what you want to expect when you go to Ziggy at the end of the day and start on that, you know, the final DI for the color correction in HDR.
Right. And so can you describe a little bit about like what kind of tests would you shoot? Were they set, they were on the sets, or they were costumes, hair, makeup? Yeah.
I mean, for me, we'd start with very basics. We'd start with charts. We'd start with Macbeth charts and check colors and check sharpness and everything like that. And also it gives you, you know, any color chart gives me a great balance to send off to Ziggy, to then send through an entire pipeline, to then receive back and check that it all matches up with what we originally shot. A few of the key things for me, again, learning what we'd learned on season 1 and wanting to, from Ziggy and I's side, wanting to improve, wanting to get something even more defined out of season 2. A lot of skin tone, so we tested actors on sets with props, with the live props. The space helmets I always thought would be a concern with the LEDs inside. I felt that another thing that was going to be a concern was we developed a kind of handheld lantern for the first 2.5 episodes that we had to test exactly on the slide that you have up at the minute. They needed to be robust. We needed to know the color that we were going to get from them. So we tested those. The big thing for me, having learned what I'd learned on the kind of global thing for me, having learned what I'd learned on season 1 was the level of blacks. That was the thing for me. I wanted to explore the lower levels of season 2 compared to what we'd done in season 1. So it became a big thing in testing, was comparing where I could see, where Ziggy was talking about before, where we could sit the highlights, but where I could still retain an information in the darkness that felt like we weren't crushing it for no reason. You know, that there was information there, or that there was a lift there. Again, just to give it a slightly softer, for, you know, it's aesthetics, but in my opinion, a slightly more cinematic feel, just feeling that the darker areas have a movement, a noise, a detail, something that's going on in there that I felt and again, personal things, but I felt I lost it a little bit in season 1, and felt it was lost, not in the DI, not in the grade, but just in the overall package, but also in the way I approached the season. And I felt that testing would help me improve the on-set lighting, which would then hopefully improve for Ziggy and improve for the final show.
Yeah, and I think
there's a bit of, we added a little bit more weight overall to the images, but we didn't do it just by crushing the blacks.
Exactly.
We actually lifted the blacks a little bit, so it was it was really just that mid grayscale range that we sort of brought down to kind of give it a bit of weight, a lot of sort of shaping with sort of vignettes and grads and things like that. But we didn't want that crushed feel, so there's still that sort of slightly lifted shadows that had a bunch of information still there.
Yeah, and I think this show, especially the first episode, has this campfire sort of feel to it, with the really warm lanterns and the shadows. So, you know, how would you, if you were talking to, say, a new producer about working in Dolby Vision and doing a show, you know, how would you make other DPs and producers feel it's not a scary thing? You can really tell your story. If your story is a darker story, it's okay.
Absolutely. I think, and I think that was the real key for me with season 2, was wanting it to feel like a darker story, and knowing what we'd learned, what Ziggy and I'd learned together going through season 1, was that you can live in the shadows without it feel, as Ziggy beautifully put it, without it feeling like you're just crushing it and making it uber sharp, and you know, all the things that producers or costume, makeup, props, design, everybody, all the things that people might be not scared of but cautious of, in that in the perception that it is just going to be sharper and there's going to be more detail and there's going to be all of this. If you prep it the way you want it prepped and you light it the way you want it lit, it will still look the same, but you're given this added adventure with HDR where you can explore the levels of color. One of the things, especially with the first 2 episodes for myself, were the lanterns. The color of the lanterns had to be so specific, so hopefully organic, compared to the very electronic world, the very digital world that Lost in Space normally sits in. The idea that these were little mini campfires that the guys had created out of, we don't know what, that was the whole point of it. You know, there's never an explanation as to where these lanterns came from. But we knew we wanted it to be an old school feel. And again, with testing, the lanterns was something that we tested backwards and forwards with Ziggy multiple times to ensure that we could get that level of diffuse lighting, that level of richness in color, and also not feel like it was suddenly, you know, it was throwing an element in there that we could just kind of sit back and go, oh wow, aren't they? Isn't that super bright? It's, you know, super HDR. If the minute you think about something like that, it's the wrong way to go into it. It's HDR is there for us to explore, not just think of as I was saying before, it's not just a delivery. It's something that can actually, it affected the way I lit season 2. It affected the levels at which I metered at on season 2 way more than it did on season 1, because I felt, with Ziggy's help, I felt I'd learned a lot having done it to such an extent in season 1.
Siggy,
Yeah,
what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we all learned a lot in season 1. I mean, season 1 was only became an HDR show right at the beginning of color.
Yeah,
a few weeks before, so everything had been shot. Visual effects had been started, and it was then switched to an HDR. So there was definitely a big learning curve for everyone to get on board that it's going to be now a Dolby HDR show. So there's a lot of education and how we go about it. We couldn't really do a lot with the calibration with the visual effects because everything had started by then. So when season 2 came along, definitely everyone was, you know, we had learned a lot. Everyone was a lot more comfortable with doing things in HDR, and then just having the calibration. The visual effects guys were a lot more comfortable. For example, in season 1, they ended up supplying a lot of mats with a lot of the visual effects to kind of help them blend and look their best in HDR.
So does that mean you would have control over that blending to help it work better in HDR?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because they were essentially monitoring everything in SDR or X709. And then when they brought it in, they were surprised on the differences, how it looks. So before we started season 2, we made sure the calibration and was really tight and that they had the right viewing LUTs. So when they came in to color, there was no surprises. And we went from like season 1 where they supplied hundreds and hundreds of mats to season 2 where they probably only supplied like a handful of mats.
And that's because they started monitoring in HDR for season 2.
Yeah,
So,
and we had calibrated what they were seeing from basically what on set, like we did, you know, Sam suggested or said that we tested prior, we created this LUT, and then we made sure everyone had the right viewing conditions. So when they came in, it looked exactly how they were viewing it back at the shop. So that was a really big leap forward in terms of just, you know, making sure everyone was comfortable. And I can't stress enough that's a big part of the process. But so when they came in, we started season 2. Everyone was really comfortable, and you know, you fall in love with the HDR. I mean, it really, HDR, especially in this show, looks stunning. We ran the SDR monitor, the second monitor, as early on in the process as possible. So because having the 2 formats and having to output them is a lot to absorb and take in. So as you know, the show really starts out like a, you know, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You have a kind of a timeline that you just have all the sort of non-visual effects scans, and then you have different just plates or placeholders or like offline that is for the visual effects. And once we kind of start getting that first influx of the visual effects for the episode, I then analyzed the timeline at that point and started kind of dialing in the SDR and kind of chasing it a little bit as we started doing sort of the getting into the color. So, and I think that's a really important part of the process with Dolby, is that the nice thing about Dolby is that you have both the HDR and the SDR up on screen at the same time. So you can be glancing between the two. And because there's so much to take in, not just the color of the HDR, it's also how the conversion is working on the SDR. You know, you can see how certain things affect, like highlights, for instance, the differences, just working in a different color space. You know, blues and yellows can look a little different. So it did help everyone, and everyone, you know, through season 1, everyone learned a lot. And so when season 2 came around, it was everyone's like, okay, there's your HDR, SDR, and they kind of knew the differences. But you know, that first season, it did take like 2 or 3 episodes to get everyone used to what was going on.
and do you think two questions about the Dolby Vision process? But first, the VFX from season 1 to season 2, by having them monitor in HDR at some point, whether it's the review station, that saved a bunch of work and probably a bunch of time. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely, okay. A bunch of time and money. They were determined to have it dialed in as much as possible. And that's why we also did a lot of pre-color on these, the warm planet section, is because the dailies went in a different direction than they decided upon. So just doing pre-color on some scenes that needed a lot of color work done was also a big benefit to them as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like that was a huge time saver, and then doing a proper amount of testing in preparation and back and forth between Sam and Siggy and working to develop that look over the course of a couple weeks
Yeah.
really helped you guys when you hit the ground running, when episodes were starting to shoot and dailies were coming in and things were moving forward. You guys were in a much better place then.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. It made a
Yeah.
huge difference, but it also just on that point, that's why it isn't really any different to shooting any other show. Just because you're, especially for Lust in Space, we are kind of primarily driving in an HDR world. But if it wasn't a primarily HDR driven show, I'd still want to do a couple of weeks prep and do camera tests and costume tests and makeup tests. So it shouldn't be an added it shouldn't be a disadvantage to be doing those things. It should be the norm. It should be what you would do anyway.
That's great. And then Siggy, back to the sort of the Dolby Vision process. So maybe, and people can watch the other episodes that we've done before this. I see there's a couple questions. There's a link that we can send you. It contains the 2 previous versions that talk about a little bit more about the Dolby Vision workflow. But essentially, you start creating the HDR image, you run the Dolby analysis, and then it maps it to SDR on the second monitor. And then you can sort of comfortably, live in both worlds and adjust for both looks, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, your hero color is the HDR, and that's what we make our color decisions on. And then we, at the same time, even though it's not a final pass, I'm also, dialing in the SDR at the same time, and everyone can glance over and see how things are tracking, and even as part of the visual effects, it's like something that may look good in HDR may not look as good in SDR. And if it's not like a final version of the visual effects, the visual effects guys are in the room and they can see both, and they can also go back and when they re-deliver the final version of the shot, they can make adjustments that suit both. And it's those benefits where, I think the Dolby process helps a lot.
Cool. And you guys did something cool that when Sam was in London shooting, he was actually able to monitor an HDR feed from Siggy's color room in Santa Monica. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we have a company 3 London based in Soho, and I think it was for a preview of one of the episodes. I think, Sam, is that correct?
Yeah.
I was working back here with the co-pro and the visual effects team and executive producers, Zach, and once we had sort of gotten in a good place, Sam was obviously working in the UK at the time on another show, I believe, and we were able to set up a system there that we could send an HDR signal to London, and we could view and discuss and talk and basically do a color session together, even though we were like half a world away.
Amazing. All right. Are there any, key lessons that you guys felt, and we haven't really talked much in terms of color, and we've talked more about luminance and contrast and detail in the shadows, but we haven't talked about the ability with Dolby Vision to get sort of more vivid colors and sort of keeping the saturation in those lanterns, for instance. Maybe talk about how you approach that and use it as an effective storytelling tool.
Yeah, I mean, the lanterns, as Sam said, they used LED lights, and that color spectrum. The thing when you're working in HDR, the colors have a lot more separation. and a lot more range to them. So they skewed slightly to the yellower side, and they also were quite bright as they were coming in. So we did a little bit of work on clamping them down. We wanted to have that sort of hot spot. They needed to kind of have that flame look, but bringing them down wasn't brought out detail that we, it darkened it, but also brought down detail. So, and that's, we didn't want the detail, we just wanted the exposure down. So I was able to clamp them down, and that's one of the tricks in when you're working in HDR. Just because you bring the highlights down, for instance, doesn't mean you have to bring the detail with it. You can just have that sort of clipped, slightly clipped, but by bringing it down just gives it a softer feel. And then the yellow, we added a little bit more warmth to give it kind of more that fiery glow that kind of made it a little bit more realistic and more sort of a natural flame, even though they weren't flames. And reds are another thing. There's a couple of scenes where you have this emergency lighting going on, and Sam lit it, and it's just like literally washed with red. And working in Dolby, the reds had this amazing saturated, but also a deep red. It wasn't kind of like a fluorescent bright red. It was like had this really nice depth to it, but had a richness and a color that I've never really seen before working in like Rec 709. And blues can be a little different. Blues have like kind of more of a P3 feel, where they have a little bit more green in them. You can still spin them to sort of more sort of a truer blue or a warmer blue, but they naturally come up a little with a little bit more sort of cyan to them, which sometimes is a little more pleasing than the sort of traditional direct blue look. So just having that extra range of color gamut is really nice to work with. Not only just that extra shadow and highlight range, as Tom said, it was just excuse me, the color range it gives you an amazing spectrum to work in. Excuse me.
Sam, what are your thoughts?
So you said it so eloquently. No, one thing you said speaks so many truths. The point of Lost in Space as a concept is for it to look, although it's set, X amount of years in the future, and the vast majority of it is set in space. We always try and retain a reality to something in there. And everything that Ziggy's just mentioned is something that, again, without going on about how much we learned between season 1 and season 2, but suddenly you realize the levels of color and separation of color that you have in HDR, and as a purely as a storyteller and purely on the aesthetics of a visual, you could tell that story really well, because we tested the lanterns. We knew we wanted them to be a bit more of an organic color compared to what anybody had seen in the previous season. So knowing that we had the ability to stretch those colors a little bit more in HDR meant that there could be a lantern just glowing in the corner, but rather than it just being a warm wash that you might see in the SDR, suddenly we could richen that color up a little bit more and just remind the audience of key things and remind the audience of specific moments. So that so editorially, also story-wise, there was always a visual reference for the viewer to have a handle on.
That's great. Well, let's take some questions from the group here. I will say, Siggy, there's a lot of questions around a little more detail around the timeline color working space. So I'm guessing, would you work in camera scene referred space, or would you work in PQ? What I guess there's just a lot of questions on your Resolve setup for that.
We're in, let me triple check here. I have a live session here. We are in PQ color space for the timeline.
Okay. Okay. So you're working directly in PQ.
Yeah.
And I've heard from several colorists and people that they prefer to work in say camera space, in this case red code or something of that nature. That was PQ working in PQ, is that harder for you, or?
Sorry, we're working off the red raw files. If there's no visual effects done on the shot, we're working with the original raw files.
Got it.
And then all the visual effects that are coming in are EXR. So essentially, they're the two file formats that are in the timeline.
Great. Okay. So your timeline format is PQ, and then there's so you mentioned that your highlights typically peak around 500 nits. And do you feel that when you've seen that playback on, say, like a modern LG OLED, that hits the right sort of target where you feel the show is represented on the consumer end of things?
Yeah, we have a consumer style monitor in the bay, which is something we also run an HDR signal to that. So during the color session, we're running essentially 3 monitors, the 2 X300s and the Panasonic. I think it's an Easy 1000 or 1500.
And so that gives you an approximation of the HDR experience for client viewing and or just as a self-check.
Yeah, it's gives you a sort of, I mean, we line the monitor up as best we can to match the X300, but given the sort of screen display, there are differences, but it's a nice confidence check, and it's a monitor the clients can also walk up to and look at in close range. It's a nice sort of large display, so it serves a number of purposes.
It's hard to fit everyone around a 31-inch Sony X300, right?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So, question around: can you guys describe the workflow and equipment needed to enable the remote color grading sessions? I mean, I think that's a hot topic with the current pandemic situation.
Well, in this particular case, we were using I believe it was a stream box that was essentially sending a signal to London, and so all the information, the color correction was happening locally here in Santa Monica. We were essentially sending the HDR signal to London via, I believe it was a stream box, and we had an X300 set up in London. So Sam was viewing the same display as we were just viewing here.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, the Streambox is the company, right? So if anybody's interested in that piece, you can do 2 setups with the Streambox, I believe. You could do what you did, which was X300 in Santa Monica to X300 in London, and they're both seeing the same thing.
Yep.
You can also do X300 at Santa Monica Company 3, and then a CMU box and a consumer calibrated TV, and the CMU will do the mapping, tunneling to the consumer TV. So you could monitor that way as well.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sam, seeing that HDR version was super helpful to you when you were in London after a day of shooting.
It was phenomenal. I mean, phenomenal. Again, as Ziggy mentioned before, the way Lost in Space pieces together is very much like a jigsaw puzzle. And after we'd finished shooting season 2, I was back in the UK. We were shooting, and Ziggy would get a sequence, or he would get an edit of an episode that he would put in, and we'd go through X amount of sequences. Some of it might be without visual effects. As Ziggy said before, there was a lot of work done on the red planet because when we were there, it wasn't particularly sunny. And these were important things to then, for Ziggy then to design LUTs to give to the visual effects guys for kind of mass global changes that were going to be made to the rest of the show. But for me, it was phenomenal. It was amazing being able to see the HDR in London while Ziggy's working on it. You know, even the time worked perfectly. I'd wrap at 6 in the evening, would be a nice sort of late morning start for Ziggy, and we could sit for half a day and map out exactly what he's seeing and be able to sign off on so many things. It was fantastic.
I mean, we also did the same thing before, you know, when we were testing.
Yeah.
Sam was in Vancouver. We have an office in Vancouver, so it was the same setup. I was here with the producers in Santa Monica, and Sam was in Vancouver, and we were able to like go through looks and setups there as well. So it was definitely
Cool. And
utilized.
sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
I was just going to say there is a question about how do you manage the highlights? Because I meant you sort of mentioned that you are sort of rolling them off and managing them. There's a couple questions around how do you recommend working with that in Resolve?
Well, there's depending on the situation. I deal with things a little differently. Sometimes I'll just do a luminance key in the qualifier and bring them down if I want some more detail. Sometimes I'll use the log control to really just and work the pivot. So I'm just working the very highlights. Sometimes I use the soft clip control. And that's a good way to clamp things. And then there's also a plugin, a Resolve plugin that has the color gamut, and you can work on just luminance levels in that area as well. That's a good way to sort of bring highlights down and clamp them. So they're depending on the scene and what I'm trying to achieve, whether it's wanting to just bring down the highlights to gain more detail, or just bring them down without seeing more detail. I approach it in different ways, but that's a select few options that some of my go-tos.
Okay, great. So I just pasted into the chat window or the questions answer a link to the previous webinars if you have more interest in learning about the process, some camera tips, etc. Sam, I'm going to leave sort of the final question to you, if I could. You know, there is a lot of sort of questions around monitoring, working with DITs, feeling comfortable, obviously using a light meter, etc. You know, what would be your biggest tips for someone planning to enter the world of shooting a show that's going to be available in Dolby Vision?
Test is the first thing. As any DP would and should and has to do at the beginning of any show. Test, find the levels that you're comfortable with, test with an HDR monitor, and meter those levels that you're comfortable with. You know, I still, to this day, I still will walk around set with a light meter and check the levels that I have tested, that I was comfortable in viewing, in testing, and I'll apply those same principles on set. It shouldn't be a scary proposition to have to go on to set even without an HDR monitor. If you've done your testing and you know what you want your show to look like, you take the same principles as you would if you were lighting any other show. You take those principles, you test them, you take them on the set, and you apply them. And hopefully you will take them into a colorist of Ziggy standing, and it'll be delivered into something that you were seeing when you were testing. It's simple. That's the truth. I mean, I'm not trying to dumb down my work or Dolby work or Ziggy's work, but the basic principles that we use as cinematographers don't change. It's just a new tool to play with, and once you've seen what you can do with it, it's really good fun. It's just good fun. It's a variant in color. It's a variant in contrast. It's a variant in luminance. But it's there for us to manage, not for it to be a. Oh, hello.
That's me. We're still here. I just launched a poll while we're wrapping up here. We'd love to hear from the viewers of who you are that's attending this webinar. And we'll ask Siggy while we launch these last two polls. Siggy, what's your final tips as colorists enter this world of HDR and Dolby Vision?
Really understand the look of what the filmmakers are wanting, and establish early on the sort of bright levels, how far you want to push the highlights. That is key before you get into any creative color. That's a really important point, and work with your cinematographer on that, and because that is one thing that will change the look of the show. And also, if you say, for instance, go too bright in that establishing that lot, and then you get into coloring, it can put a lot of extra work on you if you're having to sort of force the highlights down the whole time because the light is letting too much sort of through. So that's probably before anything the number one thing to establish before you even start doing the creative color.
Great advice. Well, there's a lot of comments from everyone that says thank you so much for doing this. The show is absolutely beautiful, and you know, they really appreciate your work, both seeing the show and taking the time with us today. So on behalf of Dolby, Red, and the folks at Netflix, Siggy and Sam, you guys are fantastic. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Tom. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Awesome. All right, take care, everyone. We'll see you on the next webinar.